The Cold War. The Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, intensified during the presidency of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. Here are some ways in which the Cold War escalated during the Kennedy administration. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had installed missiles in Cuba, which posed a direct threat to American national security. Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade around Cuba and demanding that the Soviet Union remove the missiles. This crisis escalated to the brink of nuclear war before a compromise was reached, but it demonstrated the high stakes and potential dangers of the Cold War. Space race. Kennedy also intensified the Cold War through his support of the space program. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a race to achieve various space milestones, such as sending the first human to space and landing on the moon. Kennedy famously declared in 1961 that the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Military buildup. Kennedy increased the United States military presence around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, where he increased support for the South Vietnamese government in its fight against communist insurgents. He also increased spending on the military and nuclear weapons, further escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. Berlin Crisis. In 1961, the Soviet Union erected a wall in Berlin to prevent citizens from fleeing to the West. Kennedy responded by increasing American military forces in West Berlin and delivering a speech in which he declared that the United States would defend the city's freedom and democracy. The New Frontier was the term used by President John F. Kennedy in his 1960 campaign to describe his vision for revitalizing America. The New Frontier was based on the idea of progress and change, and it sought to address issues such as civil rights, poverty, education, and scientific innovation. Here are some of the accomplishments of the New Frontier. Space exploration. One of the most significant accomplishments of the New Frontier was the United States' achievement of the first manned spaceflight in 1961. Kennedy had made space exploration a priority in his administration, and the success of the Apollo program helped to establish American leadership in the Cold War space race. Civil rights. Kennedy also made civil rights a key issue of the New Frontier. In 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill that would outlaw racial discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and education. Although the bill faced opposition from Southern Democrats in Congress, it was eventually passed as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Education. The New Frontier also prioritized education, with Kennedy proposing increased funding for schools and higher education. He established the National Defense Education Act, which provided funding for science and mathematics education and helped to improve American competitiveness in the Cold War. Economic growth. The New Frontier sought to promote economic growth and reduce poverty through policies such as tax cuts and increases in the minimum wage. Kennedy also proposed a program called the Alliance for Progress, which aimed to provide economic and social assistance to Latin American countries. Foreign policy. The New Frontier had a significant impact on American foreign policy, particularly in the context of the Cold War. Kennedy sought to promote American values and interests abroad through programs such as the Peace Corps, which sent American volunteers to work in developing countries. He also increased American involvement in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam, in an effort to prevent the spread of communism. Cultural impact. The New Frontier had a significant cultural impact on American society, particularly among young people. Kennedy's youthful and charismatic image, along with his emphasis on progress and change, inspired a sense of optimism and excitement among many Americans. War in Vietnam. The American goals and views of the war in Vietnam changed significantly from the early 1950s to the early 1970s. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, in the early 1950s, the United States provided financial and military aid to the French in their fight against the communist Viet Minh. The U.S. viewed the war as part of the larger Cold War struggle against the spread of communism. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy sent military advisors to Vietnam to help train the South Vietnamese Army in their fight against the communist Viet Cong. Kennedy saw the conflict as a crucial battleground in the Cold War, and he believed that the U.S. had a responsibility to help South Vietnam resist communist aggression. After Kennedy's assassination in the mid-1960s, President Johnson escalated U.S. involvement in the war, sending in hundreds of thousands of American troops. Johnson believed that the U.S. had a responsibility to defend democracy and freedom in Vietnam, and he saw the conflict as a test of American resolve in the Cold War. One attack that President Johnson did was the Tet Offensive. This was a series of attacks on South Vietnamese cities by the Viet Cong. American and South Vietnamese forces repulsed the offensive, and the Communists suffered heavy losses. Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war. The American people lost faith in Johnson and that we would have a victory in this war. Soon after, many people realized that the war would end in a bloody stalemate, and we could not win. Johnson announced a new plan to end the war and then declared his intention to not run for re-election in 1968. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become increasingly unpopular among the American public. The high number of casualties and the perception that the war was not winnable led to widespread protests and calls for withdrawal. President Nixon, who took office in 1969, sought to de-escalate the conflict and gradually withdraw American troops. By the early 1970s, the U.S. had largely disengaged from the Vietnam War. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, ending direct U.S. involvement in the conflict. The war had cost thousands of American lives and had deeply divided the nation. Many Americans came to view the war as a mistake, and it had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. President Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon served as the 37th President of the United States from 1969 to 1974. During his presidency, Nixon achieved several significant accomplishments, but also faced notable failures. Accomplishments: opening of relations with China. Nixon's visit to China in 1972 was a historic event that marked the beginning of a new era in U.S.-China relations. The visit led to the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries and helped to ease the tensions between the U.S. and China. Detente with the Soviet Union. Nixon's policy of detente sought to ease Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The policy resulted in a number of arms control agreements, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I and II. Environmental legislation. Nixon signed several pieces of environmental legislation into law, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Improved relations with the Middle East. Nixon played a key role in brokering a ceasefire in the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and several Arab states and helped to improve U.S. relations with several Middle Eastern countries. Failures. Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal, which began in 1972, was a major political scandal that eventually led to Nixon's resignation in 1974. The scandal involved the attempted cover-up of the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. Vietnam War. Nixon inherited the Vietnam War from his predecessor and promised to end the conflict. However, the war continued until 1973 and resulted in the deaths of thousands of American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. Economic policies. Nixon's economic policies, including wage and price controls and a temporary suspension of the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold, were largely seen as ineffective and led to inflation. Civil rights. Nixon's record on civil rights was mixed. While he supported some measures, such as the desegregation of Southern schools, he also opposed busing to achieve school integration and was criticized for his administration's handling of protests and riots in African American communities. The 1970s were a time of economic turbulence in the United States, with high inflation rates and an energy crisis linked to the price of oil. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, causing a significant increase in the price of oil. This led to a spike in inflation as higher oil prices increased the cost of producing and transporting goods. The high cost of oil also caused a ripple effect in the economy, as businesses passed on their increased costs to consumers in the form of higher prices. The resulting inflation was further exacerbated by factors such as government deficit spending and wage increases. As inflation continued to rise, it became a major economic and political issue, leading to efforts by the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates and control inflation. The link between oil prices and inflation in the 1970s highlights the interconnectedness of global economic factors and their impact on everyday life. President George W. Bush. George W. Bush became President of the United States in 2001 after a controversial election that was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. Bush was governor of Texas before running for president, and he ran as a Republican in the 2000 election against Democrat Al Gore. Ralph Nader's candidacy in 2000 is what pushed Gore to the left. The election was hotly contested, and both candidates winning close races in several key states. The final outcome came down to Florida, where a recount was ordered due to close vote margins and allegations of irregularities. After weeks of legal battles, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush, effectively handing him the presidency. An important part of elections is political machines. That is when someone trades services for votes. During Bush's presidency in 2002, Hispanics became the nation's largest ethnic group. There were 4 major Hispanic groups at this time, yet all members of these groups tended to be relatively poor. In September 2002, the Bush administration released the statement of its New World Policy, National Security Strategy, NSS, of the United States. According to this document, the goal of U.S. foreign policy was to extend the peace by encouraging free and open societies on every continent. To achieve this goal, the United States accepted the role of global policeman. The United States would remain military strength beyond challenge. The Bush administration asserted the right to use preventative force. The new policy asserted America's role as final arbiter of all international disputes. As president, Bush focused on issues such as national security, tax cuts, and education reform. In response to the 9/11 terrorist attack in 2001, he launched the War on Terror, which included military action in Afghanistan and Iraq. He also implemented a number of controversial policies, including the use of enhanced interrogation techniques and warrantless wiretapping. Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act, which aimed to improve education standards, and he implemented tax cuts in an effort to stimulate the economy. Bush's presidency was also marked by several challenges and controversies, including Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans in 2005, and the Great Recession, which began in 2008. He faced criticism for his handling of these issues and for his administration's response to allegations of torture and other human rights violations. Despite these challenges, Bush remained a popular figure among many conservatives and was re-elected to a second term in 2004. President Barack Obama. Barack Obama faced several significant challenges during his pregnancy, particularly during the first decade of the 21st century. Challenges. Economic crisis. The United States was hit hard by the 2008 global financial crisis, with high unemployment rates and a struggling economy. Obama's administration implemented policies such as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to stimulate the economy and prevent a full-scale recession. Healthcare reform. Obama's signature legislative achievement was the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare. The ACA aimed to increase access to healthcare for millions of Americans, but faced significant potential opposition and legal challenges. Foreign policy. The United States faced several foreign policy challenges during Obama's presidency, including the ongoing war in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, and tensions with North Korea and Russia. Social issues. Obama's presidency was marked by significant progress on social issues, such as LGBTQ+ rights and immigration reform. However, these efforts were met with resistance from conservative lawmakers and interest groups. Political polarization. The United States became increasingly politically polarized during Obama's presidency, with deep divisions between Republicans and Democrats. This polarization made it difficult for Obama to pass legislation and achieve his policy goals. Despite these challenges, Obama remained a popular figure among many Americans and made significant progress on several key issues.